All right. There we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Hizzy Hustle. Today, we're just going to take a quick look here at some possible scenarios, kind of just how these tariffs might play out. I know I had said in my earlier live stream that I think 3% were the number that we were going to hear, but considering the press conference that was given last night, it doesn't sound like that is the case. And we should be fully expecting 25% tariffs tomorrow. So we'll take a deep dive into that as it happens. But for now, we'll just kind of see some scenarios play out and how that can be affecting Canadians. So first things first, let's just take a look here. So over the last 24 hours, we got 58 new listings, 11 price decreases, 2 price increases. That's interesting. And 2 solds, or 19 sold. Sorry, not 2 solds. 19 solds, 18 canceled, and 7 expired. So, yeah, some happening is going on. Nothing too crazy, but a lot of more listings are coming on the market. That's for sure. A lot more than are selling. So something to take into consideration for a grand total of 6,744 listings here in the Okanagan. So another one to take into consideration, BCREA's first quarter housing forecast, saying that 14.3% price increase. I would just like people to take into consideration that if these tariffs end up going through tomorrow, we should expect a full swing change for all these numbers, because there's no way that any of this stuff is going to line up if we get hit that hard. There's just too much going on. So yeah, let's take a look here.
The Bank of Canada just made its first interest rate decision since a trade war with the U.S. became a real possibility. They cut their overnight interest rate a 1/4 percentage point, which is great news for anyone borrowing money. But they also acknowledged that a storm may be coming.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
Trump's promised tariffs have the potential to throw Canada's economy into a tailspin.
Tariff!
In the case of a protracted, significant trade conflict, it would badly hurt economic activity in Canada.
There is still a ton of uncertainty here about how all of this will play out, but the Bank of Canada did lay out a worst-case scenario and what it might mean. Let's go through it.
Some people seem to expect there to be more rate cuts in the future if tariffs were to be implemented. But if tariffs were to be implemented and inflation were to go back up, in order for us to get inflation back down, wouldn't they need to raise the interest rates to cool the economy or to help combat inflation at least? That's what they did during the pandemic, right? But does the situation change because of it being just a like an external tax essentially that's pushed onto us, or just like a lack of being able to move products? Like how does that kind of affect, right? Like, do you think that they would be lowering interest rates to try to give a little bit of ease to Canadians, or what? Like, it's a really tricky one to kind of estimate what's going to happen.
So what is the most severe scenario? Well, it's where Donald Trump goes full steam ahead and implements 25% tariffs across the board, as he said he'll do, and where Canada implements sweeping retaliatory tariffs in response.
Which is the other problem too. Like, I really, really wish that our government would stop trying to threaten the U.S., before at least trying to solve the problems that he was talking about, because a lot of Canadians would agree that our border has not been very tight, and the fentanyl pandemic or epidemic that we have in our country is leaking into the States. So I totally get what's going on there, but we should see if we can solve our own issues, which would potentially get rid of this tariff problem in the first place or whatever. So it's almost like a win-win. We don't get taxed and our country gets better. kind of seems like the right route to go for me, but whatever. I'm not a politician.
As they've suggested they might do. The first thing the Bank of Canada predicts is that this would cause a significant decline in the volume of exports from Canada to the U.S., which makes sense because
mainly cars.
Tariffs are just taxes.
It's their biggest one.
By the businesses doing the buying.
And they still haven't decided whether or not there is going to be a exemption on oil, which is our main export, but we'll see.
So if American companies suddenly have to pay more for the same Canadian stuff because there's a 25% tax on everything Canadian, they might just decide to buy less stuff to avoid the tariffs altogether.
What tariffs should do is decrease anybody's willingness to buy the more expensive product and make them come up with ways of finding something cheaper, something more efficient, something closer to home.
And if demand starts decreasing for Canadian exports, the value of those exports could drop too.
Usually when there's less demand for a product, the price of that product falls as well. And the Bank of Canada is saying that would happen here.
Whether you're exporting to the US or not is almost irrelevant. It's just merely the fact that you are producing more than what your domestic economy needs.
So you take those things together, lower demand for Canadian goods and lower prices for those goods, that's bad news for Canadian business. And you know what Canada exports an awful lot of? Oil.
If you take $10 off the price of oil, that's, a couple $2 billion less of royalty revenue that the province is bringing in.
And here you start to see how every downside outcome causes another downside outcome, like dominoes falling one by one. Because the Bank of Canada writes that eventually that kind of hit to business would cause Canadian exporters to lower production and lay off workers. They've got to scale down if they're not making the same kind of money, right? There's no exact figure for how many jobs they think could be lost, but
we would probably expect the unemployment rate rises about a percentage point or so.
You're easily talking into the hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Easily.
Doug Ford says as many as 500,000 jobs in Ontario alone.
I mean, let's not take Doug Ford too seriously. He's also trying to win an election at the moment.
Just about everybody involved in this has a slightly different figure, but the short answer is an enormous number of Canadian jobs are exposed to this, are at risk as a result of it.
And it's not just job losses, because when you think about how Canada might retaliate, putting countervailing tariffs, taxes on American imports to Canada, I mean, just think of what American products you rely on any given day.
Things like fresh fruit and vegetables, which obviously it's winter in Canada. We import a lot of those from the United States.
There's also cars, machinery, drugs, chemicals, electronics. Those might all become more expensive too. For the same reason that U.S. tariffs make things more expensive in the U.S., Canadian companies importing American things will have to pay Canadian tariffs to the Canadian government. And in many cases, some or all of those additional costs may eventually be passed on to Canadians.
Not eventually. There is no situation in which a corporation will eat the costs of the consumer. The consumer will always be handed all of the cost. It's just the way it's going to go. There's nothing that you can do unless you were to implement through legislation that there is a maximum profit margin that can be made, in which all you would do is send all those corporations into a different country that doesn't charge these taxes anyway. It's the same with the capital gains tax. It's the same with the carbon tax. When you put these taxes on, sure, you might have an idea of doing something with it, or it's a price on pollution, or it's for the rebates for Canadians, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter, because when you have a place that doesn't charge these taxes, the corporations will go there. It doesn't matter. If the whole world were to be on the same page with implementing these carbon taxes, with implementing all these types of regulatory things, then I can totally understand how it would work, because everybody's on the same page. But when you essentially take one person and put them into a different pool of it's profit. It's all about profit and capital. So if you're going to take portions away from that capital growth that are essentially like, they're just superficial, they're external, they can be removed, there's no point to them, because in Canada, if you look at our carbon footprint in comparison to other countries, we're doing so well that I don't even understand why we have the carbon tax. It's crazy. People should be paying us. Like, it's wild that we're the ones that are taking the brunt of it. It's just crazy. So then you add that on top of other taxes and other external forces or whatever, and the average Canadian just gets hammered.
The reality is that the more of their stuff that we tariff, whether as part of the supply chain or whether as part of just being consumers, that we consume the products directly, we're going to start paying more money.
So, lost jobs, less purchasing power, which brings us to the Bank of Canada's next prediction. According to the Bank of Canada, all of these factors together could cause Canada's GDP to fall pretty significantly. They do acknowledge in their analysis that the government could mitigate this by taking some of that tariff money that they start charging and pumping it back into the economy, either to businesses or consumers.
That is the only thing that they should be doing with these retaliatory tariffs. The only thing that they should be doing is taking the money that's being charged to Canadians and giving it back to Canadians in some other form, whether it be investing in infrastructure for these corporations or businesses so that they can continue to employ people. If it's, I don't even want to see checks going out to people anymore. This is the worst possible way to be spending money. It's so unuseful. They need to invest in our country's infrastructure. They need to invest in energy. They need to invest in oil. They need to invest in real job producing, income producing resources, because just taking that money and giving it back to people in the form of a $250 check is so useless. It's unbelievable.
Themselves. But even still,
this would have a very material effect, would have a very severe effect on economic activity.
So how severe are we talking? Well, here's where we begin to understand how impossibly complex this question becomes. Because instead of giving just
dominoes,
one
right?
definitive prediction in this case, the bank maps out multiple ways in which this one scenario could play out, depending on how quickly businesses pass on their extra costs to us, the consumers, and how everybody responds to this general idea of certain things becoming more expensive. But best case, they predict next year, Canada's GDP would be 2.2% lower than what it would have been otherwise. Worst case, 3% lower. To which maybe you're like, 3%. That's not so
bad.
Except it's bad enough to throw the country into a recession.
The economy is growing about 1.8% right now. In their assumption, if we get a 2.5 percentage point hit to growth, that's pretty consistent with normal recession in Canada.
I think the interesting thing here is it's effectively a permanent recession. There's no real way out of that drop in GDP. And I think that's where it starts to get really hard to really measure and get your head around what that actually feels like, what it looks like.
But that's why we need to start focusing on the core examples as to why these tariffs are being implemented in the first place versus trying to retaliate against them. They need to be proactive, not reactive.
So here's one more question. If this worst case scenario does play out and this brand of tariff war forces Canada into a recession with no clear endpoint, how exactly might the bank respond?
I don't
We're
think.
talking about interest rates, right? That's the lever the Bank of Canada has. But on this, the one real thing we turned to them for guidance on, they were actually pretty cryptic, opting not to give any real indication as to what it might do next.
There's a lot of uncertainty out there, and it just didn't seem very useful to provide guidance. And even when we do know more, we're going to have to do some more work to figure out exactly how that's going to play out through the economy.
But
once again,
we've asked the question.
reactive,
We've
not
all been
proactive.
through recessions before, so let's try to answer this question anyway.
Typically, the response you would see to that would be the Bank of Canada cutting interest rates when the economy weakens.
Not this
Right,
time, though.
because if you lower rates, you make it cheaper for Canadians to borrow money, which makes it more likely that they'll spend money, and that can help stimulate a struggling economy. But it's not so simple. Because we're not just talking about a lagging economy. We're talking about higher prices at the same time.
Growth will be weaker, inflation will be higher.
Because that's the direct impact of tariffs. When things like fruits and vegetables get more expensive, that's inflation. The Bank of Canada...
I hope you guys are excited for $9 avocados.
Number one...
Not a package of them, just one.
...priority is inflation and keeping it in check. And it is predicting in this severe scenario, yes, inflation goes up. By how much? Again, depends on too many things to calculate ahead of time. And what happened most recently? When inflation was a really big problem in this country, what did the Bank of Canada do? It raised interest rates aggressively to cool the economy and try to get prices under control. And it worked. So there's reason to think maybe they'll be forced to do that again, and we'll end up in a rate hiking cycle, which lands us now with the opposite solution that we had just outlined of cutting rates to give a lagging economy a kickstart.
So which one do? You can't step on the brake and the gas at the same time.
It becomes a really, volatile, interesting, and confusing mesh of countervailing forces all at play at once.
Now, we could get into the specific reasons why one solution might be better than the other, and why there's reason to think that a rate hike is actually the least likely scenario.
So in a normal cycle, you would have a really strong economy, and that's driving.
Because they were talking even in that announcement that they had, well, Korea announced at last week or whatever that they apparently had heard that the Bank of Canada had one scheduled rate drop for 2025 without taking tariffs into consideration, and that there would be more potential relief if tariffs come into play. So what I would probably expect to see is down then up, if things don't kind of work out. Because if they're expecting these tariffs to be temporary and then to be repealed, then the best thing would be to give Canadians some relief in interest rate cuts. But if that's not the case, and tariffs are going to be a long-term thing where we're talking about the potential 4-year mandate, then things play out totally differently. And I think the long-term effects on our economy are going to force the Bank of Canada to probably raise the rates again, because inflation will get too high, and the prices of goods will get too high, and the demand will be too low.
Driving inflation because there's so much demand out there. The difference in this environment is that inflation is being kind of imposed by these tariffs and pushed through to producers and consumers at a time when growth is actually weakening.
But really, you can start to see why the Bank of Canada's governor today kind of just threw up his hands.
Monetary policy cannot offset the economic consequences of a protracted trade conflict. We can't lean against weaker growth and higher inflation at the same time. So, what are we going to be doing? Well, we're going to be assessing the relative weight of those two.
The bottom line being,
which one's the biggest issue? Who do we tackle? How do we tackle it first before we move to the next one?
This would be a pretty unprecedented spot for Canadians and the Bank of Canada to be in. And though the bank can do all it can to try to understand what Canadians can expect next, they've also made clear it's pretty much impossible to know for sure.
Well, there it is. Trying times in the future. Now, not too much to get into political stuff or whatever, but I just wanted to kind of show this video of Mark Carney's recent press conference this morning, where he has now followed Chrystia Freeland's tune of canceling or scrapping the consumer carbon tax, which is just absolutely insane to me that the Liberals are doing this now, because they've been screaming that this carbon tax is like the best possible thing ever for Canadians, and it's putting so much money back into the pockets of 8 out of 10 Canadians. We've heard these talking points for years now. So it's wild that they're just all of a sudden flipping the switch on us or whatever. But let's see what he has to say about it.
Canadians have had more than enough of such division and confusion. With Canada now under attack, it is time to come together. And since Canada's current climate policy has become too divisive, It's time for a new, more effective climate plan that everyone can get behind. It's a plan that makes our economy more competitive, it grows good jobs today, and it will grow better ones in the future. You know, friends, there are literally billions of dollars of investment on the table and millions of jobs.
That investment will not stay there if you continue to chop into their profit margins.
At stake. So here's how our new plan works. My government will immediately remove the consumer carbon tax. But we won't stop there. Instead, what we'll do is create a system of incentives to reward Canadians for making greener choices.
See, this is something that I can agree behind when it comes to trying to get people to choose green and be more economy friendly or environmentally friendly. You need to incentivize people to make decisions that are good for themselves and for the environment. You cannot force people to pay a tax on carbon pollution when they're not the problem. When you see places like China and India like just dumping billions of tons of emissions into the atmosphere, and Canada is one of the greenest countries out there, it's just insane that we're getting nailed so hard with these taxes to essentially do nothing net positive for the world. We're still going net negative in the world. Like I said before, if everybody were to be on the same page, this is a totally different story, but it just feels like Canada's paying for the rest of the world at this point.
So it means that you'll no longer have to pay more to fuel your car or heat your home. But when you choose an energy efficient appliance or an electric car or home insulation, you will be rewarded, and we will get the big polluters to pay for it.
I don't agree with that. There's no way it's going to happen. They're just going to reduce production, or they're going to find other avenues or whatever. Like, I don't know who he's planning on going after, because like who are the big polluters? Like Suncor, like energy producers? Is it oil companies? Is it manufacturing companies? Is it the car manufacturing? You know what I mean? Like what avenues are you pursuing that are these big polluters? And you know, what avenues are going to be affected by these tax changes and stuff like that, right? Like, we need to know which sectors of the economy are going to be directly affected by this stuff so that we can prepare for them as consumers. Because, you know, if they're planning on taxing our oil at the higher level, but they're going to get rid of the carbon tax for the consumers, then is it really different, or is it just the same?
En tant que chef,
well, that was pretty much it for the announcement. I just wanted to kind of go over that part and see what's going on. But yeah, we'll tune back in tomorrow at some point to go over the tariff announcement. But as for that, that's it for this week. Yeah, I mean, I'll probably go live if I see something happening that sparks my interest over the weekend and stuff like that, but this is kind of like a Monday through Friday type of thing that I'll be doing. So yeah, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Hizzy Hustle. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you can tune in when we go live in the mornings here, and follow me on TikTok at the Hizzy Hustle. Yeah, we'll talk soon. Stay safe out there and save your money. Pay off your